In this video, I'll show you how I moulded and cast these Turgore action figures, a recent collaboration I did with Theo Cane from Slimehouse TV. I'll explain how I made silicone moulds for each part of the fully articulated figure, and I'll also explain the resin casting techniques I used to create this marbled resin effect. There should be some handy tips and tricks for anyone just starting out, as well as a few advanced knowledge nuggets for the more seasoned crafters. Turgore was a collaborative project between Theo Cane from Slimehouse TV and myself, Uncle Matty of Rainbow Yarn fame. Turgore was designed and sculpted by Theo, who provided me with 3D prints with which to make the moulds from. If you'd like to learn more about Theo's design process, make sure to check out his video over on the Slimehouse channel, which explains it all in more detail. I'll put a link in the video description. I didn't have to design any articulation for this figure, as it was already in place when I received the printed parts. However, as the figure was printed in firm resin, it wasn't possible to properly test out the articulation at this stage without risking damage to the prints. I find it's best when making articulation if the female parts of the joint are soft and the male parts are hard.
Oh my!
With that in mind, I wanted to make a cast of the torso first in flexible resin, as that had all the female articulation holes in it. That way I can test the joints without the risk of snapping any pegs off. I make a mould box for the torso by sticking a cup to a piece of foam core board using a hot glue gun. I attach the torso to the foam core using a blob of monster clay. This will later act as a pour spout to pour the resin in once the mould is complete. I mix up some RTV tin cure silicone, which I then vacuum degas in a vacuum chamber. I put a small amount of silicone on any areas of the cast that I think could be prone to getting air bubbles trapped, and then I leave it sat at an angle and allow that to set. I then prepare more silicone and fill the remainder of the mould box. Once set, I remove the mould box and the clay from the base. I trim the edges of the mould and create some simple registration marks on top of the mould using some snippy tools. This will help the second part of the mould to lock in place in the correct position each time when I'm casting. I lubricate the top of the mould using Vaseline, making sure to rub it into all the little grooves that I've just cut. This will stop the silicone I pour on next from sticking to the first part of the mould, as silicone does stick to itself. I take care not to get Vaseline on the torso print itself, as that can leave an unwanted texture on the surface of the casts later. For the second part of the mould, I just use some parcel tape, which I neatly wrap around the entire mould, creating a kind of a funnel on the top. I also make sure to wrap the bottom of the mould with tape so that the silicone won't leak out. I then pour silicone into the funnel to make the second part of the mould. I'm using RTV tin cure silicone, so the glue on the tape doesn't seem to inhibit the cure or leave any tackiness behind. This tape funnel mould box technique might not work with platinum cure silicones, as they can be a lot less forgiving to use. Once that's set, carefully separate the two parts of the mould. Silicone will stick to itself, but the two parts shouldn't be stuck together thanks to our slippery old friend, Vaseline.
Yeah, boy.
I wanted to make a marbled resin test cast using semi-flexible polyurethane resin. There are a couple of different brands that I use for this that are available in the UK that are pretty much the same thing, but if these aren't available to you and you're looking for something that's easier to find locally, then I would suggest searching for a semi-flexible polyurethane that has a shore hardness of A90 to A95. To make the test cast, I first fill the mould with red resin, then tip as much of that back out as possible, and then quickly refill the mould again with black resin. Thanks to the large pour spout on the mould, it's easy to be able to pour resin in and out quickly before it begins to set. Side note: this technique will not work as well with resins that have a low viscosity, like easy pour, watery resins. This flexible resin's quite gloopy, so it gets a nice thick lining round inside the deep crevices of the mould. I was happy with how the marbled resin effect turned out. However, what I didn't like was the large seam line round the top of the torso, which was quite visible even with the head on. I decided to alter the mould to make the pour spout more narrow, which will make the seam line less visible, as it will be hidden under the head. This time I cover the inside of the mould where the silicone touches the cast with Vaseline. I put the torso print back into the mould and use monster clay to make a new pour spout, this time more narrow than the first. I make sure there's no Vaseline on the top of the mould, as I want the silicone I'm going to pour on to attach to it this time to make one solid piece. And then pour on more silicone. Once that's set, I remove the monster clay, and this has successfully created a more narrow pour spout which will be less visible on the finished casts. I tidy it up slightly using a sharp blade, and then I repeat the process from the first time. Snip some new registration marks, lube up with Vaseline, make a tape funnel, and pour that silicone, baby. You can see me using an electric toothbrush rested against the moulds here while I'm pouring, just to try and help shake free any would-be trapped bubbles. This isn't really necessary as I had already vacuum degassed the silicone before pouring, but it can be a handy tip if you don't have a vacuum chamber or pressure pot. After making another marbled resin cast with the revised mould, I was a lot happier with the results. You can see the seam line is a lot less visible now once the head is on. Once I had a flexible resin cast of the torso, I was able to then test the articulation by pushing the prints of the arms, legs and head into it. They all worked fine, with the only exception being the head, which did tend to pop out quite easily when turned. I made a quick easy mould of the neck peg using some masking tape and a dollop of silicone, and then used this mini mould to make a copy of the head joint cast in firm resin. I cut that off and attached it to the joint of the head to elongate that male peg slightly.
Oh my god! Wow!
I painted all of the 3D prints using black acrylic spray paint to give them all an even semi-gloss finish. The final casts will have the same finish as the original piece I used to make the mould. Adding a gloss clear coat to a piece before making a mould will give the casts a glossy finish, while adding a matte varnish before making the mould will give all the casts a matte finish. As a matte myself, I can tell you that a matte finish will be better if you're planning on painting or adding a clear coat later, as the paint or varnish will be more easily able to adhere to the resin. A glossy finish, however, can be better if you're planning on making clear casts or marbled resin effects that don't require a clear coat. For the head, I made a pour spout using monster clay, and then made another mould box using the same technique of a cup stuck to a piece of foam core board. I then poured on the silicone. Once it was set, I removed the mould box and trimmed it just to tidy it up a bit. I then used the same technique as the torso mould to make the second plug part of the mould. Snip, remove clay, lube, tape, pour. I'm not going to show it every time, but I do always prepare the silicone prior to pouring by degassing it in a vacuum chamber. Once set, I remove the tape and carefully separate the two parts of the mould. I cut down the sides of the mould, making a shallow zigzag cut to create a registration mark, and I then make sure that the cuts are straight and clean where it meets the cast inside. The zigzag outer edge cut will create a registration mark which clips the mould back together in place, minimising seam lines. I made quite a wide pour spout again, which will come in handy when doing the marbled resin technique later. My first attempt at a cast with the head mould was problematic. An air bubble got trapped in the neck joint, causing the peg to be hollow. To fix that, I use a piece of copper tubing which I push into the mould. This cuts a hole through the silicone, punching out a little silicone sausage, leaving only a small air vent in its wake. This will allow any trapped air bubbles to escape out through the top. I trimmed a small funnel on the top of the mould which can hold a small amount of resin. This can then drain back down into the mould if any trapped air bubbles rise up while it's in the pressure pot. The mould then worked successfully, with the joint now casting solid every time and just one extra vent needing cut off the bottom of the peg. Next up is the leg mould. I attach the legs to a piece of foam core board using Gorilla Glue mounting tape this time. I use some cocktail sticks to make air vents and then make the mould box in the same way as before using a cup and a glue gun. I pour the silicone, and once set I remove it from the mould box and carefully remove the mounting tape from the bottom of the feet. Or should I say hooves. I prefer using Gorilla Glue mounting tape to standard double-sided sticky tape, as the silicone's less likely to seep underneath. It makes for a nice clean edge that usually does not require any trimming or cutting. I then repeat the same process as on the previous moulds.
No, not again!
Snip, lube, tape, pour.
No, not again!
Once set, I separate the two parts of the mould and then carefully cut down the sides to release the legs. Again, I make a zigzag incision on the outer edges of the mould and a nice clean straight cut on the inner part of the mould where the seam touches the casts. I made some test casts with the new mould using the same marbled resin technique as before. Stay tuned and I'll go into a bit more detail about the marbled resin casting process later on in the video. Now it was time to tackle the most difficult mould, which I had intentionally put off till last. I made some pour spouts on the inside of the arms round the joints using monster clay. I then created air vents using cocktail sticks in any places that I thought could be prone to trapping air bubbles when the resin's poured. I made a mould box using just foam core board this time. I wouldn't advise making a mould box in such an unorthodox shape, as it did make my life a little more difficult later on. I pour in the silicone and then top up with some silicone chunks. I made the chunks by chopping up the unused plug part of the torso mould that I made earlier prior to adjusting the pour spout size, so it didn't go to waste. Once set, I remove the mould from the box and trim off any excess. I remove that monster clay from around the joints, and then snip, lube, tape, pour. In the past, when making moulds, I would make pour spouts that go directly into the back of the arms and then cut and sand them off after casting. If I were to do that with this marbled resin technique, however, then I'd be left with large visible marks which spoil the marbling effect. To avoid that, I made the pour spouts go round the joint on the inner part of the arm. I then create a plug to pop in so there'll be no pour spouts to cut off these casts, just a seam round the inner part of the arm. Once set, I carefully removed the top plug part and created a couple of air vents to let any trapped air bubbles come out when I push this plug into the mould once full of resin. I then cut the mould in half to release the arms. This was quite a tricky one to cut. Bit of a brain boggler. Occasionally I use a surgical retractor tool to help hold the mould open whilst cutting. I use the same technique of cutting a zigzag line around the outer edges of the mould to create registration marks while keeping the cut straight and neat where it meets the cast. This is a 3-part mould with this top plug part which will push in once the mould's full of resin. I was happy with how these casts came out. The seam lines were successfully hidden on the inside part of the arm, and thanks to the large pour spout on the moulds, the marbled resin effect worked well. It's important that the moulds have wide pour spouts for this marbled resin effect so that I can quickly tip the resin in and out of the moulds before it begins to set. First, I prepare the moulds by spraying them with a Mould-Release Spray. I can get different finishes on my casts depending on which Mould-Release Spray I use during the casting process. A wax-based Mould-Release Spray leaves a matte finish and it can be easily washed off so that the paint adheres well. A silicone-based Mould-Release Spray creates a glossier finish, but it's a lot more difficult to wash off and often impossible to completely remove. This can make paint unable to adhere to the casts, but it can be better if you're wanting to create a clear cast or marbled resin without the need to add a clear coat later. I mix up some red resin and pour that into the moulds. I try not to mix up more resin than I need, and I pour the red resin from one mould to another, making sure that each has been filled before tipping out the remainder into an off-pour mould. I then rest the moulds with the pour hole facing downwards to drain out the majority of the red resin while I prepare the black resin. I mix up the black resin and fill the moulds completely. Pop all the lids or plugs on, and then put all the moulds in a pressure pot until the resin's set. And here is the demoulding process for the first Turgore figure. Nice. All of the parts cast successfully, and I was happy with how the marbled resin effect came out. With the moulds for the main figure now complete, it was time to make moulds for the accessory and minifigure, Scrock. I wanted to make a 2-part squish mould for the axe, so I made a mould box out of Lego, which I then filled with hot melted monster clay. I pushed the axe in and made some registration marks, tidied it up a bit, and then poured on the first part of silicone. Once set, I removed the Lego mould box, flipped the mould over, and carefully removed the clay. I usually try not to remove the original, in this case the axe, from the first part of the mould when making a 2-part mould. It can make pouring the second part of the mould more difficult as silicone can seep underneath and create an unwanted effect. However, it couldn't be avoided on this occasion, so I just applied vigorous amounts of Vaseline underneath the axe in case any silicone were to seep under when I pour the second half. Here is the first cast of the Hell Axe with the new mould. There's no pour spout on this mould as the axe is too thin for resin to pour through, so I just made a squish mould. I pour resin into the 2 halves of the mould and then just squish them together. I was worried that the axes could be a little floppy if cast in flexible resin, so I used a rigid clear polyurethane resin for the axes and minifigure. Speak of the devil, here is Scrock. I made a mould box for him using Gorilla Glue mounting tape, glue gun, foam core, cocktail sticks for air vents and a cup, and then poured the silicone on. Once set, I removed the box. Quite a simple one-part mould this one, just required a little bit of cutting to help ease the little fella out. Bit of a crazy mould to look at once cut, but it worked. Here's the first test cast. Here's what all the finished moulds look like when complete. A lot of work's went into them, but they've served me well. And here's the first batch of 13 unpainted marbled resin Turgore figures. I then sent the figures down to Theo, who painted the details and sorted out all the packaging box art. Again, you can see more from Theo's side of the collabo via the link in the video description. Theo did a great job with the painted deets and also took these brilliant photos. Theo did some amazing artwork on the packaging. We even included a holographic collector card printed by Resin Cards with every order. Resin also did stellar work on printing all the boxes for Turgore. And here he is, Turgore, complete with Hellax and Scrock minifigure. Theo and I released 9 of these figures for sale to the public at the tail end of 2023. We were blown away by the response and super quick sellout, so we decided to make a second run. This time, Swamp Assault Turgore. We went with a different colourway of green and black marbled resin this time, and Theo even designed a new swamp axe for the variant. I'll put a link in the description for the second video that Theo did over on the Slimehouse channel, which explains a bit more about the backstory and lore of Swamp Assault Turgore.
Oh, that's hot. That's hot. Oh, wow.
I made a new mould for the new swamp axes, and this time the mould can cast 3 in 1. As the axes were a little thicker this time, I used the semi-flexible polyurethane instead of that rigid resin again. I mentioned earlier about the shape of this mould being impractical. I realised during the casting process that if I put elastic bands round the mould to keep it together, it applies pressure on the ends and warps the mould, pushing the 2 halves apart slightly and causing a big seam line on the casts. To fix this, I made a resin plate to hold the floppier side of the mould firmly in place. This applies even pressure when casting and stops the mould from warping. I made this by putting tape round the edges of the mould and pouring rigid resin on the top. And that is the story of how I made the moulds and cast these Turgore action figures. I'm sorry these have all already sold out, but I do hope this video can still help to inspire anyone considering making their own toys. Stay tuned to Theo's page for more news on the next stages of evolution for Turgore. He's been back in the lab and turned him into a giant sofubi. So make sure you stay tuned to Theo's page for more info on when they will drop. Also, stay tuned to my page for more videos on my toy making endeavours. I've been a bit quiet on YouTube these past few years, but I have some more craft and toy videos in the works, which I'll be uploading in the coming weeks. If you've got any questions regarding anything you've seen in today's video, or if there's anything you'd like me to cover in a future video, please feel free to leave a comment and I'll try and respond to as many questions as I can. If you think this video's helped you out at all, please consider giving it a like. And why not subscribe to my channel if you don't already? All the cool kids are doing it. Thank you for joining me. I've been Uncle Matty, but you can call me Unky. Goodbye.
Come on!